Hello to everyone and welcome. I'm Rakshita Saluja, Executive Editor of Equality at Bloomberg News. And today, I'm thrilled to be joined by three wonderful guests to talk about the future of LGBTQ rights. Joining us are Alphonso David, President of the Human Rights Commission, Katherine Franke, James L. Dohr Professor of Law at Columbia University, and Michael Lopez, Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer at Hewlett Packard Enterprises. Hewlett Packard Enterprises, I will note, is a sponsor of the Equality Summit. Alphonso, Katherine, Michael, thank you so much for joining this panel today.
Thank you.
So let's jump right in, because there is a lot to talk about when it comes to the future of LGBTQ rights and the challenges that lie ahead. And Alphonso, I'd like to begin with you as the policy person on this panel and talk a bit about the Equality Act, the proposed bill that would amend federal civil rights laws and extend protections to cover sexual orientation and gender identity in the workforce, in public spaces, and in government programs. The bill has won House approval twice now, in fact, and its fate now lies with the Senate. And if passed by Congress, President Biden is expected to sign the bill. Alphonso, you delivered testimony at the Senate hearing yesterday. But as a practical matter, on an everyday basis, how significant would the passing of the Equality Act be for the LGBTQ community?
Well, thank you. The Equality Act would be quite significant for the LGBTQ community. Today, in 29 states in the United States, LGBTQ people are not protected from discrimination. We don't have comprehensive protections. So we can confront discrimination when we get into a taxi or livery service. We could confront discrimination when we try to purchase a product in a retail store, or we can confront discrimination when we try to serve on a jury. That is why we're advocating for the Equality Act, which is, as you said, a federal bill that would provide consistent and explicit non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ people in key areas of life: employment, housing, credit, education, public spaces, federally funded programs. It would clarify that to add sexual orientation and gender identity as a protected characteristic to existing civil rights laws. And the Equality Act would also add sex and non-discrimination protection to public spaces, as well as federally funded programs. I know that many people are sometimes assuming that we are protected in all facets of life, but we're not. 22 states and more than 125 cities have adopted common sense, inclusive, comprehensive protections, but unfortunately, 29 states don't. And we have a lot of support for this bill. The majority of Americans support the Equality Act. We have more than 400 major companies that support the Equality Act that are a part of the business coalition. We have Hewlett Packard, Apple, Kellogg's, Starbucks that support the Equality Act. And yesterday, the point was to make sure that we communicate to the American public how important it is that we protect people from discrimination. We've heard a number of claims, and I can go into that if that's helpful in terms of debunking some of the claims that we heard. Just in the spirit of being efficient, I'll just raise two basic arguments that we've heard against the Equality Act, and I want to debunk both. The first is that the Equality Act, the claim is that the Equality Act would destroy women's sports, but that's false. We've had equality acts in states for decades: Minnesota, Illinois, New Mexico, Virginia, California, New York, and the list goes on. And in those states, women's sports still exist, and people are thriving in those states and cities. We also have advocates for women's and girls, National Women's Law Center, the Women's Sports Foundation, the women's leaders in college sports that all support the Equality Act. And the second claim that is really baseless is the claim is that the Equality Act would destroy religious institutions. And again, that's false. When the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, churches, mosques, synagogues continued to practice their religion, and they still do. And when state and local laws were passed as far back as the 1970s, those same religious institutions survived and thrived. I think what our opponents are seeking to do is really not protect religion, but perpetuate discrimination. And so we wanted to really highlight for the public that it is well established that we cannot dictate what you do in your religious institution. But if you provide services to the public, then we do. And that is what the Equality Act would do, was make sure that LGBTQ people are protected under law.
Exactly. And Katherine, this sort of takes me to you. we've seen significant forward movement for LGBTQ rights through the courts over the past decade, despite backlash from conservative and religious groups. And we've seen strong calls for religious exemptions in the Equality Act. Could you walk us through and help us understand whether carving out a broad exemption in the Act could still allow for the bill to achieve what it has set out to do?
Well, what the Equality Act does, as Alphonso just described, is incorporate protections on the basis of gender identity and sexual orientation in a broad array of federal laws where other groups have been protected really since 1964. So it's a modernization of our infrastructure of civil rights protections on the federal level. And it's important to recognize that that existing structure already amply accommodates religion, religious practice, religious institutions, et cetera. And so to incorporate very broad additional protections in the Equality Act is really to say that there's some reason why we shouldn't extend sexual orientation and gender identity protections in the same way that we have for other protected groups. It's to give lesser protections to the LGBT community than, say, racial minorities, sexual minorities, religious minorities, other people of color and of other different national origins are already receiving. And so the call to include these broad religious exemptions in the Equality Act is really to say that these would be second-class rights as compared with the rights that are already protected for other minority groups or persecuted or discriminated against groups in the United States.
Exactly. Michael, as the business representative on this panel, let's talk a bit about corporate America's role in advancing LGBTQ rights. Alphonso mentioned a few companies, including yours, but let's just go back a bit. Big companies, came out in support of the Marriage Equality Act in 2011, the striking down of the Defense of Marriage Act in 2013. Where do you think the push for LGBTQ rights stands right now within corporate America's policies today?
I think it's alive and well. To add into the comments around the Equality Act, the Equality Act assures that our team members inside the organization aren't beholden to a patchwork of legislation that means that they have to worry about their rights in public accommodation and other areas as they go from town to town. It's just not tenable. And we've been at this, as you suggest, for years. For me personally, it started more than 12 years ago inside of a manufacturing company and changing policies to enable, gender neutral bathrooms and transgender guidelines. And as you suggested and recalled, marriage equality in New York was a watershed moment where 24 CEOs and organizations came out. And if we look at this historically, we know every civil rights movement has been enabled with business, with allies. And so inside the organization, it continues. And the way it continues now, particularly inside of HPE, is we're increasingly taking an intersectional view around the data. So, no longer do we look at things in aggregate, right? We look at the dimensions of LGBTQ separately, examine them against ethnicity and gender, so that way we understand the lived experience of individuals in consideration of power and privilege.
Yeah. Earlier this week, the Vatican declared that the Catholic Church will not bless same-sex unions, saying, and I quote, "God cannot bless sin." Does that statement further complicate the push for advancing LGBTQ rights here in the US, both in terms of policy and in the courts? And Katherine, maybe we start with you.
Well, the Catholic Church has long had positions that are, let's say, take a different perspective on equality for a wide range of people. We don't have female priests in the Catholic Church yet, and a Jew cannot become pope. Although a Jew was the beginner of the Catholic Church, who started the Catholic Church in the form of Jesus. But what's important to know is that these laws that we're seeking to expand to include sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination don't reach religious institutions. They don't reach the Catholic Church, a Jewish synagogue, a Muslim mosque. No one will be forced to marry people who, in their faith tradition, are not entitled to the sacrament of marriage under the rules of their faith. And churches are free to have their own religious rules around a whole range of things. What the Equality Act is designed to do is reach public institutions, employers, housing, businesses, as Alphonso described, where the church should not have any role. Sure, religious institutions can have their own rules and should. And we have ample protections for religious liberty, which I think is a virtue of the American system of law, that we protect very robustly religious liberty and at the same time hold dear values of equality and liberty that protect a wide range of other people who may not be within a faith tradition or might. So the last thing I want to say that on this issue that I think is really important is often this issue gets framed as LGBT rights on the one hand and religious liberty on the other, and they are not in opposition to one another. There are plenty of people in our community, in the LGBT community, who are people of faith. There are also plenty of people of faith who believe in LGBT rights. So this is a false opposition, I think, that we often hear about of, well, there's one side that cares about LGBT rights and the other side that cares about religion. What we often see is that there are people of faith in the LGBT community who want to get married to a same-sex partner as part of their religious practices. And when they do, their employer fires them. So you have religion on both sides. So it's important to remember that the people who are asking to have broad religious exemptions in the Equality Act are looking to protect religious liberty for employers, not individuals, but for companies. And the idea that a company could have a faith as opposed to individuals having faith is a kind of odd and uniquely very recent idea. So religion's on all sides of this. This is not something where there's an opposition between equality and religious liberty. They're intertwined with one another.
Rakshita, if I can just co-sign on everything that Katherine just said, because I think it's so important for people to appreciate that these arguments are not arguments we're hearing for the first time. We heard these arguments when we debated marriage equality. I had the privilege of drafting the marriage equality law in New York, and we heard the same argument. If you allow same-sex couples to marry, that means that religious institutions will be forced to marry same-sex couples. That wasn't true then and is not true now. So we have to really take a step back when we hear these arguments that profess that, the Equality Act will compromise religious faith. That is not true. That we have the First Amendment, we have the separation of church and state. And if you provide services to the public and you're a place of public accommodation, then we regulate it. If you're not, then we don't.
As you said, Alphonso, go ahead.
Just personally, as a former minister of God that is an openly proud gay man, to the points raised, this isn't an us versus them issue. The notion that LGBT members can have religious identity or spirituality is completely false. I mean, we show up in our communities in every way, both with the faith communities, as well as in the workplace, as well as every part that you can imagine.
Yeah, definitely. Alphonso, you mentioned arguments that have been used in the past. And one of the arguments that have been used in the past and that are playing out now is around transgender athletes participating in girls' and women's sports. More than 24 states across the country have considered a ban on transgender children from participating in sports under their affirmed gender. What's your take and how do you see this playing out?
This is an argument that's being advanced by national extremists that are looking to oppress LGBTQ people. I frame it that way because I think it's important for us to appreciate that there are states all over the country that have comprehensive laws that protect LGBTQ people. We have civil rights laws in states and localities that have existed since the 1970s. And women's sports still exist in those states. So, and I said before, advocates for women and girls in sports also support the Equality Act. What we're seeing is anti-equality extremists who are trying to find the next target. And I'm not making this up. This was reported in the New York Times in 2019, where an advocacy organization essentially said, we did a poll, And we determined that attacking LGBTQ people as it relates to bathroom bills is no longer effective. So we're going to now go and attack them with respect to sports. They are using young people to score political points. And that is reprehensible. And we're seeing these bills pop up all over the country. But they're in search of a problem that doesn't exist. 20 states, the NCAA, and even the International Olympic Committee already allow transgender athletes to participate and have for years. And we've seen no competitive advantage or widespread dominance of transgender athletes. So we are actively engaged at the Human Rights Campaign. We know our partners are engaged as well in states all around the country to really make sure we address the disinformation that has been unfortunately propelled by anti-equality extremists.
Can I add one historical note to that? Is that in the 1950s and 1960s, after the Supreme Court decided Brown versus Board of Education and struck down the idea that we could have separate and supposedly equal racially segregated society, one of the first forms of resistance against Brown versus Board was the integration of bathrooms. And there were protests across the country on behalf of white women that somehow Black women being in bathrooms with white women posed a public health and safety risk to white women. So too, the idea that we would racially integrate sports, the argument was made that Black people are too good at sports, right? They'll have an unfair advantage over white people. And racist tropes about how Black people's bodies are made were circulated then in ways that made the argument that it's not fair to racially integrate sports. You can just pick up the words race and put trans in now. And the same arguments are being used in sports and in locker rooms and in bathrooms that used to be racist. We would understand today that these are incredibly racist arguments, and today are transphobic. Change is hard for people. Change is very hard. And so we ask those who are so uncomfortable with the idea of extending gender identity and sexual orientation-based rights in our national civil rights infrastructure to just come along. And as Alphonso says, look at the states where this has already been done for years, and sports and bathrooms and the workplace and housing hasn't fallen apart.
And if I could add, and the reality is all of these tactics are for naught because the data doesn't lie. Right, the recent Gallup poll indicates the percentage of individuals that identify as LGBTQ plus is increasing to 5.6%, and among Gen Z, the largest growth is in individuals that identify as bisexual. So, this is a war against a mega trend that is happening, and the community continues to come out of the closet and will not be banished, whether inside of workplaces or in public.
Michael, hold that thought on Gen Z, because I do want to come back to that in a bit. But for now, though, what should companies be doing to make transgender, non-binary employees feel secure in their jobs and thereby thrive in their careers?
Yeah, I think employers need to continue and embed, as we have, the simple model: listen, learn, and act. Right, and put it on repeat, because we're in a period of divisiveness, of social unrest, and I think it's appropriate to take a pause and call out what happened yesterday and what's continued to happen over the course of the year to our Asian community, and it is abominable. We have to stand for it together. An attack on one of us is an attack on all of us for equality, and in organizations, we're embedding this very personalized, listening, empathetically forward initiative with communities, so that way we understand the changing dynamics. Things are changing at a pace and that we haven't seen in previous years since the civil rights era. And I fully expect that it will continue. And so it's imperative for organizations to continue those lines of communication, adapt to them, address those issues, and take the organization along with them, including leadership.
Definitely. Let's switch gears and talk about the pandemic and the economic and cultural pressure that the LGBTQ community has faced this past year. The poverty rate for LGBTQ Americans is 22% higher than for cisgendered straight Americans. And that was before the pandemic threw millions of Americans out of work. We've shed a lot of light on how the pandemic has been devastating for women and for people of color. But Alphonso, let's begin with you. How do you think the last year has affected the economic situations of the LGBTQ community? And what can be done from a policy perspective or any way to help?
Well, the pandemic has had a devastating impact on the LGBTQ community. Before the pandemic, 1 out of 5 LGBTQ people lived in poverty. Those numbers are worse now. Of the top 5 industries that LGBTQ people worked in, they were heavily impacted by the pandemic, I should say. More than 5 million LGBTQ workers, or 40% or so, worked in industries that were disproportionately impacted. And it's worse if you're LGBTQ and a person of color. If you're a person of color and LGBTQ, you're working in industries that are disproportionately impacted. You're living in an environment where you are discriminated against because you're LGBTQ, and you're living within a culture that unfortunately is still struggling with systemic racism. So we know that the pandemic has had a significant impact on a community. We often don't talk about poverty when we talk about LGBTQ, but we need to. Because as I said before, 1 out of 5 LGBTQ people live in poverty. And the images that we see and we talk about when it relates to LGBTQ identity is simply not reflective of the larger community. And what we need to do is make sure that we actively engage in this effort to make sure we elevate and support all members of our community. You know, I gave a speech about a year ago where I talked about how we can see beyond ourselves. And I keep on going back to that theme because I think it is critical. We have to see beyond ourselves. Katherine talked about this before. How do you make sure that you can look to history and we don't end up repeating our history? The same tropes that were used with respect to race are being used with respect to trans. And we have to make sure that all of us are collectively thinking about how do we see beyond ourselves and care about the policy issues that don't affect us? How do we care about the issues that don't directly affect our families, but instead affect our communities? And if we can see beyond ourselves, we can really get to a place where we're supporting policies, we're supporting changes in our society that can elevate all members of our community. And I think that's what we have to do.
Does seem like acknowledging the problem is probably the first step to figuring out solutions and addressing them. Michael, what can companies do to bring LGBTQ and, as Alphonso said, LGBTQ people of color back into the workforce?
I think there are a couple of things. One, from the specific point of view of bringing back into the workforce, what we're doing is looking at not only our giving, but our engagement with organizations. And we're taking a local lens because we understand that community is experienced locally. So looking at our local investment of time and funds, and really understanding how that is dispersed between communities and appropriating it in an equitable way, a key goal for us. And then internally, and I referenced it a bit earlier, is from a data perspective, we're looking intersectionality. So we track the information and we can understand communities that don't identify as LGBTQ or choose not to identify, as well as individuals who choose not to identify based on race and ethnicity. The good news is, on an actual basis, that number is relatively small. The bad news is we know statistically that individuals that are covering either LGBT or racial ethnic diversity tend to be 10 to 15% less engaged. When you compound those two things, it rises to 15 to 20% less engaged. So looking at that intersectional data for organizations is imperative to make sure that our messages and our programs are reaching those individuals.
Absolutely. And you talked about Gen Z a bit, and I just want to touch upon the Gallup poll that you referenced. The latest Gallup poll that came out last month, I think it said that 5.6% of US adults self-identify as LGBTQ, and nearly 16% of Gen Z self-identify as LGBTQ. That's a big number. How should institutions or corporations be taking in that number and realizing that there is a generation that's joining the workforce now that is increasingly self-identifying as something other than heterosexual?
The interesting part about that data is I think 11.5% of that number identified as bisexual, which is a part of the community that honestly we haven't talked enough about. So it's a clear signal that particularly in the LGBTQ plus community, we need to continue our outreach to others to understand those lived experiences and initiate those conversations in order to prepare for the expectation from our workforce.
Rakshita, if I can just jump in here for a second. I think part of what the data that Michael's referring to is showing is that the old categories that really are a relic of the 1950s or 40s of classifying people as either exclusively heterosexual or exclusively homosexual, the old Kinsey scale, are out of date, and young people don't identify with them. And part of what the Equality Act is trying to do is update our laws so that they recognize that greater complexity. And the odd thing is that the Supreme Court's already there. The Supreme Court is leading the way. Last term, the Supreme Court recognized that the term sex in the sex discrimination and employment statutes that we have on the federal level already include gender identity and sexual orientation-based discriminations, so that that term can capture a lot more than maybe we were thinking about in 64 or 54. That we need to modernize the way we understand our human rights laws and our non-discrimination laws to reflect a more popular understanding of our own identities that are a bit more fluid than we used to think of them. And so that data that Michael's citing, I think, is really important.
Yeah, definitely. Alphonso, did you want to weigh in on this as well?
Sure. Look, I think when I've had the privilege of running two separate companies, one before law school and one after. And I think most CEOs will say that their greatest asset is their workforce. But unfortunately, what I think we are seeing in some cases is that businesses aren't really updating or creating value systems to make sure they are valuing all of their employees. To Katherine's point, the old systems that existed for how we define ourselves or how we identify are changing and shifting. And companies have to make sure that they are modernizing the way they interface with their employees and assigning appropriate values to how they interface with all of their employees. There's this really interesting and bizarre construct that we live with in this country. I call it the hierarchy of identity. Where companies and social constructs are created to, for example, for me, my race may be in some people's eyes more important than my sexual orientation, more important than my immigration status. And what happens in some cases is that those infrastructures, that hierarchy, is then shifted into the workplace, which is a problem. And I think what companies should really think about doing is first, make sure you define your values. And make sure your values are actually reflective and implemented in a way where all of your employees are treated equally. And when it comes to being treated equally, identification is important. How you refer to people is important. How you classify people is important. And I'm hoping that more and more companies are coming forward and appreciating the importance of that. At the Human Rights Campaign, we work with a number of companies. More than 1,000 businesses participate in the Corporate Equality Index. I would encourage more and more companies not to only work with us, but other non-for-profit organizations do this work to make sure that we are making workplaces as inclusive as possible.
We are running out of time, unfortunately. But before we wrap up, really quick lightning round to each of you. What's the single most game-changing policy or legal decision or initiative that you think will really move the needle of where we want to be? Alphonso, I want to start with you.
The Equality Act. The Equality Act will be a sea change in how we're treated all over the country. I don't have to worry when I leave New York or Washington, D.C. and travel to another state, get into an Uber, and be concerned about what I'm saying on the phone because Uber, Lyft, or livery service, not to just target Uber, and be thrown out of a car because I'm LGBTQ, or walk into a store and face discrimination.
Katherine?
Well, Alphonso already claimed the Equality Act, so I'm going to say the Equal Rights Amendment. The House of Representatives yesterday voted, approved a bill that would lift the deadline on the Equal Rights Amendment, and that will include rights for LGBT people and sex equality more generally, and write it explicitly into the Constitution. Very important.
Michael?
I will have to reaffirm the Equality Act. It is the only way that we will assure protections of LGBTQ plus employees, team members, family members, regardless of where they are in this country.
Katherine, Alphonso, Michael, thank you all for joining us today and bringing your insights to such an important topic. I really do appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rakshita.